For those of you who don't know, my name is Courtney Grant.
I'm Erica Patterson.
Dylan Sondermann.
And this past summer, we spent 3 months living and working in southern Belize with Yache Conservation Trust to rewrite the management plan for Bladen Nature Reserve. So a little overview of what we're going to be discussing today. I'm going to go over the social ecological context or the background to Bladen, Belize, and Yache. Erica's going to go over the plan or what it's comprised of the components. And then Dylan's going to go over the process or the how it happened. We're all going to come back and discuss our side projects that we did, some reflections and acknowledgments, and then at the end of our presentation, we're going to have about 10 to 15 minutes for some questions if you guys have some. So just delving right into it, Belize is a Central American country. Mexico's to the north, Guatemala is to the west and the south, and the Caribbean Sea to the east. It is a small country, only about the size of New Hampshire. Population is 375,000 people. Just to give you some more perspective of how low that population really is, Denver has around 700,000 residents, so twice the amount of people living in Denver than the entire country of Belize. Belize is a relatively young country. They gained their independence from Great Britain in 1981, formerly known British Honduras. So consequently, their national language is English. They're the only Central American country to have English as their national language. However, Belize is very diverse. You have mestizos, so the Latinos, they speak Spanish. You have Mayans, so Quechua and Mopan, Creole, Garifuna, East Indian, Lebanese, Chinese, Mennonite, so very diverse culture. Unfortunately, there are high rates of poverty throughout Belize. Around 20% of the urban population and 42% of the rural population live below the poverty line. So as you can see on this map here, Belize is comprised of 6 districts. I'll go more in depth to Toledo district on the next slide. Belize has a lot of protected areas, 108 to be exact. This includes private spawning aggregation sites and crown bird nest colonies. So Belize is actually one of only 12 countries in the world to meet the CBD Target 11, which is to conserve or protect 17% terrestrial and 10% of their marine areas by 2020. And as you can see here, Belize far exceeds that with having 36.6% terrestrial and 19.8% of their marine areas in some form of protection. So Toledo District, as I mentioned, it's one of 6 districts of Belize. It is the southernmost district, and it is also the least populated. There's a population of around 35,000 people. It is also the poorest district. Around 65% of the population live below the poverty line. So to paint a picture of what that looks like, people live in houses with dirt floors, thatch roofs, no running water, no electricity, they don't have screens. So this creates a high dependency on the surrounding forest for survival. People go into the forest to collect non-timber forest products, hunting, sometimes they'll clear the land for agricultural use. This creates a high dependency on, this creates a challenge for having protected area management. And then also Toledo does have a growth rate of 2.5%, so that only exacerbates that issue. So Punta Gorda, aka PG, it's the headquarters of Yache. It's also the capital of Toledo District, around 6,000 people living there. It's also where we lived for our duration this summer. Just to give you a perspective of how big it is from PG to get up to Bladen, which is right around here, it was about an hour and a half, hour and 45-minute drive. So Yache, this was our partner organization that we worked with. They were established in 1998. They're an NGO who has 4 main areas of focus. The first being foster sustainable livelihoods. An example of this is they have a collaboration with the Forest Department and the Trio Farmers Cacao Growers Association. So Yache and the Forest Department work with 35 families from the nearby Trio village to provide sustainable income by way of selling cacao. Biodiversity conservation. Every year they produce an annual biodiversity synthesis report on all of their protected areas. Environmental education is also a very important component. Here's a picture from the summer camp. So it's like a week during the summer and every single day had a different theme. I'll talk a little bit more about that on my side project. And last but not least, they do protected area management. So they own the private reserve Golden Stream Corridor, which is right here, and they manage it solely by themselves. Bladen Nature Reserve and then the Maya Mountain North Forest Reserve are co-managed between Yashe and the Forest Department. And as per the National Protected Areas System, they are required to renew their management agreements every 5 years, which is why we were commissioned to rewrite the management plan for Bladen. So Bladen, a little bit more about that. It is considered the crown jewel protected area of the Belize. This is due to the high amount of biodiversity, large amounts of intact soils, caves, sinkholes, and archaeological sites within its boundaries. It is an IUCN Category 1A, so it's a strict nature reserve. So what that means is absolutely no tourism or extraction is allowed of any kind. Only research and education is permitted with a permit. It's 100,000 acres. So this little zone 1, that is the natural environment zone, that's where the majority of the research and the education occurs. It is actually where we were fortunate enough to get to take a day trip hike into it. It's beautiful. We actually got to see a spider monkey. It was so cool. And then zone 2 is the larger, and as the name suggests, that is the preservation zone. Yashe and the Forest Department really want to limit the amount of human disturbance, so no education is allowed within that and very limited research. As mentioned, Bladen has a lot of biodiversity. So that's not just animals, they have a lot of plants, as they have 22 different ecological communities. And then rising threats. Unfortunately, Bladen is not immune to threats that other protected areas around it experience. And this is verified by the rangers at Yashe. They use smart technology on their patrol. So basically, they have a tablet similar to this. And when they see infractions happening, they can put in the GPS coordinates, and it stands for Spatial Monitoring and Reporting Tool. So it allows them to know what's happening, where, and when, so they can have more specialized patrols in the future. And then to zoom back out on a national scale, Bladen is one of only 4 nature reserves in Belize. As I mentioned, it's 100,000 acres. And just to paint a better picture of how special Bladen is, the next largest nature reserve in Belize is only 5,000 acres in size. So as you can see on this map, Bladen, BNR, is located right here, and it's completely surrounded by other protected areas. So they form a network or patchwork of protected areas known as the Maya Mountain Massif, which is the largest intact forest up north of the Amazon. And that links with the lowland forest of southern Belize to create the Southern Biological Corridor, which is a wildlife corridor. And so speaking of corridors, it is Belize and Bladen. Belize is right up there. It's part of the Mesoamerican Biological Corridor. So Mesoamerica spans from southern Mexico all the way down to Panama. And a wildlife corridor acts as a land bridge for species that require large amounts of intact ecosystems. So in this case, the ecosystem being broadly tropical forests, and the species could be jaguars. So Mesoamerica is considered a global biodiversity hotspot. It's one of 34, and it is the 3rd largest. It holds 8% of the world's biodiversity, and it's home to 5,000 endemic species of plants and animals. And for those who don't know what endemic means, that means it's only found in this location throughout the world. This is a picture of a howler monkey, which is an example of an endemic species. And we also got to have a pretty close encounter with one of these guys at the Bamboo Sanctuary. And then finally, Mesoamerica helps to combat climate change by way of carbon sequestration. They have a little over 87,000 square miles of forest. So this helps sequester a lot of carbon, and we know carbon is a greenhouse gas that warms the world's atmosphere, contributing to climate change. So that was a little rapid-fire background of Belize and Bladen. I'm going to hand things over to Erica, and she's going to discuss the plan in more depth.
All right, thank you. All right, so now that you have a nice background of Belize, I'm going to get into a little bit more of what we were doing while we were down there. So we were charged with the update of the Bladen Nature Reserve Management Plan. And through this we created a new management plan, along with a much larger document and annexes that go into more depth information that's not found within the plan. Also, while we were down there, we created a visual management plan, which is an abbreviated version of the management plan and highlights some of the key aspects pulled from managing Bladen Nature Reserve, such as the management goals and priority areas of action. Finally, we created a plan evaluation workbook, which is an Excel workbook that helps to streamline annual evaluation of conservation targets and threats. As I said, our focus includes this plan, and Courtney hit on this a little bit, but it was necessary to update the plan in order for Yakshay to renew their co-management agreement with Bladen, or the Belize Forest Department. It's a 5-year plan stretching from 2017, which I realize we're already coming to the end of, through 2021, at which point it will need to be renewed. Our final document was a 50-page plan, and this is pretty significant because the original plan, or the previous plan that we started with, was 106 pages. And feedback from our organization was that they needed a smaller document that was more easily digestible. So management plans in Belize follow a national standard for protected area management planning that was created by the Protected Area Conservation Trust, or PACT, the Nature Conservancy, and the Belize Forest Department. Management plans under these standards fall into 4 sections, and ours follow those 4 sections as well: the introduction, current status, conservation planning, and management planning. It was really helpful to have this existing template in many ways, as it gave us some guidelines as we moved through the process of updating this plan, but it was also occasionally restricting as to how much we could actually accomplish in changing and updating the plan. So I'm going to spend the next several minutes talking about the different sections of the plan, what is found in each of those sections, and some of the major changes that we made during this update. All right, so the introduction goes over the background and context, kind of an abbreviated version of what Courtney just gave us, as well as the purpose and scope of the plan. The purpose here being to manage this nature reserve, and the scope being the nature reserve itself, as well as the 5-year timeline. Section 1 had really minor changes that really reflected changes made throughout the plan. One of those that we would like to highlight is the addition of a new goal in management planning, which is to regularly evaluate the management effectiveness of Yakshay Conservation Trust, and where appropriate, adapt conservation strategies and actions for BNR, Bladen Nature Reserve. So here I just want to highlight that adapting conservation strategies is more a flexible management of the reserve to account for changes as they occur over the 5-year period. And this came out of a recent consultation with Carla, who is joining us, and our executive director, Christy. Section 2. This gives the manager and reader a really comprehensive understanding of Bladen Nature Reserve. It goes into the location, where it's located, and Courtney nicely outlined that for us. And then it really delves into the social ecological context of the reserve. Within that subsection, we have legal context, so how Bladen Nature Reserve fits into Belize's legislation and land tenure. And to go into that, nature reserves and protected areas are managed by 3 different ministries in Belize: the Ministry of Tourism and Culture, the Ministry of Forestry, Fisheries, and Sustainable Development, and the Ministry of Natural Resources. And our reserve, Bladen Nature Reserve, falls under that second one, which has jurisdiction over the Forest Department. In addition, our reserve follows federal legislation, including things such as the Fisheries Act, which in the context of this reserve protects the freshwater environments and fishery resources of Belize. There you go. Oops, sorry. So then it gets into kind of some key stakeholders in the reserve. And this being like people who have some sort of connection to the reserve, whether directly or not. And some of these might include PACs, the Protected Areas Conservation Trusts, NPAS. Yache is a very key stakeholder in the Belize Forest Department as well. Next, this section goes into the physical environment, including the climate found within the reserve, such as temperature, humidity, rainfall. Up on the screen now, we have a graph of some monthly average low temperatures, which hover around 70 degrees Fahrenheit, and monthly average highs, which are up there around 100 or higher. So it's hot. It's very hot. And these green and yellow lines are your monthly average min and high humidity. So it's hot, it's humid, it is the tropics. It's something that we all had to get used to being in Belize, coming from Colorado, where it's a much drier heat. Section 2 next goes into some of the biodiversity, outlining the ecoregions and ecosystems found within the reserve, and some of the key wildlife, such as the Baird's tapir, the harpy eagle, and the jaguar. Finally, Section 2 covers the cultural heritage found within the reserve, and this includes archaeological sites as well as culturally significant plants and wildlife. And this picture is not from within the reserve, but it is just outside of Punta Gorda, and Courtney had the opportunity to go visit. So within Section 2, a couple of changes. Since the last plan, a lot of some of the legislation has been either updated, revised, or created, and these include the Forest Act, which was revised in 2017, so we made changes to reflect that, as well as the National Protected Areas System Act, which was amended in 2015, and the National Forest Policy, which was created in 2015. So that was one of the primary drivers in this update, was making sure that it reflected changes to these legislations. Within the biodiversity section, Dylan meticulously went through and updated the IUCN status for each of the species found within the reserve and added new species where relevant. And finally, under the physical climate section, we expanded each of the subsections under this to include the relevancy of climate change for the reserve, looking at how changes in temperature, extreme weather events, and less rainfall is going to impact the reserve over time. Moving on to Section 3, conservation planning. Dylan is going to go over this section and the next section in much more detail. However, I do want to briefly outline the content as well as some major changes. So under Section 3, we get into conservation targets. These are broad targets that, when managed for, adequately conserve the different ecosystems and species that fall underneath each target. It then goes into conservation threats, so threats to these targets, which range from illegal hunting and fishing to extreme weather events or even dereservation. Using the conservation targets and threats, the conservation planning section then prioritizes conservation action, which informs conservation strategies, and finally informs and falls into measuring success. And this relates back to that evaluation handbook that I was telling you about earlier. So we worked into the plan an evaluation timeline that really gets into a schedule of updating the status of conservation targets and threats so that as things change, management can be shifted to reflect those changes.
It's hard on this week.
Within this section, we had a couple of major changes. We removed one of the conservation targets from the previous plans. This was the lowland pine ecosystem. There is quite a bit of this ecosystem found surrounding the reserve, and it is threatened by increased fire severity and frequency. However, it doesn't actually fall within the reserve itself. So while it's a threat outside of BNR's boundaries, it wasn't deemed relevant for the management plan. We also changed the name of one of the targets from cultural heritage to archaeological sites. Cultural heritage kind of suggests that there is more being managed for than just artifacts. However, when you get into managing these different targets, it was focused on artifacts and not the biological components of cultural heritage. Under conservation threats, we added 2 new threats, those being gold panning, and there's evidence of that occurring within Western BNR, which is the much harder to access portion of the reserve, as well as potential oil development. Section 4 is a big one, management planning. It goes into a review of the previous management plan, and like I said, Dylan will touch on that more. And then it outlines management goals. These goals are pretty broad. They're more vision statements for how Bladen Nature Reserve should be managed, and this comes from the need to be flexible with management of the nature reserve. And as I mentioned earlier, we did add this 5th goal to regularly evaluate the plan. The management goals then inform management strategies, which are reflected by the management programs and actions. And these management programs and actions come from Yakshay Conservation Trust and the co-manager, the Belize Forest Department. And so the management of Bladen Nature Reserve kind of gets melded with the more broader vision of these 2 organizations. Section 4 then goes to future research and capacity building opportunities, and finally ends on management policies that come from Belize Forest Department and Yakshay and inform management of the reserve. The major changes, as I mentioned, the addition of the evaluation goals, and then looking into strategies. It was pretty cool, I guess, for us that several of the strategies from the previous plan were still relevant for this management plan. However, we did add a couple of new ones. One of those was the co-management evaluation, and this comes from a mutual understanding of Yakshay and the Belize Forest Department that if the co-management system is to continue to be an effective way to manage protected areas in Belize, it's going to need to be evaluated and amended so that it better reflects the roles and responsibilities of each of the co-managers. Another recommendation that came out of this summer was to market research opportunities, and that goes into the addition of a research and capacity building subsection in section 4 that looks at marketing different research opportunities within Bladen Nature Reserve that if could potentially bring in more funding, personnel, or technical expertise that would then build the capacity of Yakshay and its ability to manage Bladen Nature Reserve. With that, I'm going to hand things off to Dylan, and he's going to delve into these sections a little more.
Thanks, Erica. So now that we have an understanding of the backdrop of Punta Gorda and southern Belize and what goes into each of the different sections of the management plan, I'm going to talk a little bit about how we got there and some key events that led us to this final plan. And first, we had a very collaborative team environment, both within the 3 of us and with our partner organization, Yakshay, but we did have some specific roles as we moved through the summer. Erica was really focused on that section 3 relating to the conservation targets and threats, and she was also our editor-in-chief. That made everything look good. All of my focus was on the natural history and biodiversity sections, mostly found in section 2 and also in the annexes. And then Courtney, as she did today, took on the context and did a great job of framing the situation. And as we moved through the summer, all of us were responsible for planning and leading the consultations that I'm going to tell you about shortly, as well as any strategy review or planning and creating recommendations for Yakshay. So we each had some sections in the management plan, but overall it was a very collaborative effort. So I'm going to walk you through some of the initial steps we took, and then talk a little bit about the internal consultations that we had with Yakshay and some external consultations with other stakeholders. When we first arrived in Belize, we had already started the literature review, but we arrived to a pile of documents from Saeed, the science director. We spent a lot of time reading different documents, researching different aspects of the plan, reviewing the past plan, really with the goal of ensuring that we have an accurate and up-to-date plan. This is also when we visited Bladen, as Courtney alluded to, so that gave us some great context and perspective. And we also, at this point in time, edited the previous plan to reduce the length, as Erica mentioned. So as we moved through the process, we would have a really manageable document. And these initial steps really gave us a great baseline to work from. We held, like I said, it was a very collaborative environment with Yakshay, so a lot of stuff wasn't decided in these formal consultations. It was more on the fly. But we did have 2 formal consultations during the month of June, and those were a great opportunity to get a lot of information in a really short period of time. The first consultation, if you can read the agenda on the left, we basically went through the previous management plan front to back, and at this point in time, we had lots of time to formulate questions and some ideas. And so just reading through with the Yakshay leadership and staff was great to review the plan, find additional resources that they might know of that we were unaware of. This consultation is also where the idea of a community forum was born, and that's something I'll follow up on in a little bit. And also at this first consultation, we revised those goals to include the 5th goal, as Erica was talking about. The second consultation with the Yakshay leadership and staff was much more specific and focused on conservation targets to start. We went through with the leadership team. Some of the rangers were there. It was a really good group. And ranked each of the targets on a viability rank of poor to very good based on the size, condition, and landscape context of each of the targets, and then those combined to give an overall score. And each of the 5 conservation targets, after we discarded the one, rated out as either good or very good, showing that the reserve is in a good state ecologically at this moment in time. Next, we went through the threats, and they were rated kind of using a 2-part system. First, they were rated with scores based on the proportion of the reserve that would be affected by the threat, the severity of the threat, when the threat might occur, how urgent the situation is, how long it might take to recover from the threat, and finally, the probability that this threat will actually occur. And once that happened, they were weighted with a non-intervention implication weighting. Basically, if management actions will result in some positive effect in mitigating this threat, they get a weighting of 2, which will bump their score higher on the list. The higher the score, the more prominent the threat. And as you can see from the list, when we first went through just those basic 5, hurricanes and oil exploration were some of the top threats because they affect such a large portion of the reserve and recovery is very difficult. But you can't do much to manage for hurricanes or oil exploration in the context of the Belize government. However, hunting, jate harvesting, and fishing, all related to illegal intrusions, when we added this weighting score, bumped up to the top of our list. And that really became a focus of our plan, and it's a focus of Yakshay as well, to reduce the illegal intrusions. At this consultation, we also reviewed the objectives or measures of success from the previous plans on a scale of got worse to succeeded. And a lot of these measures of success or objectives were very broad in the previous plans, and so this made it somewhat of a subjective exercise. However, even in this subjective exercise, almost all of the measures of success rated as either improved or succeeded, meaning this organization seems to be on the right track. And finally, Courtney touched a little bit on those 2 management zones, the one with education and the one with more limited research. And at this consultation, we decided we didn't change the location of either of the zones, but we reworded them to make it more explicit that research is allowed in the preservation zone as long as it's low impact and has a permit. Research had been going on in that zone, although it was not explicitly allowed in the past, and so we really wanted to update things to make it closer to what's actually going on. At the end of this consultation process within Yakshay, we sent out our first draft to a small team of reviewers, worked a little bit on our side projects while those were being reviewed. We'll tell you about those in a second, and also began to plan external consultations. The external consultations were a challenge for us. When we first got to Belize, we met and talked with the Yakshay leadership. Jen was there. So these weren't that necessary. We didn't have to go through a full stakeholder analysis. They didn't want us to. And then as time progressed, it really came out that they did want us to go talk to some people about this. And so towards the end of summer, we began to plan out and meet with a few different stakeholders who would have an interest in the plan and also be able to give us good feedback. We met with these 4 organizations on the screen formally, but there was also kind of a snowball effect where each of them was able to give us a name or 2 different names, and we were able to email them the second draft of our plan and get their feedback remotely. We took a pretty informal approach to these consultations. We'd give a short 10 or 15-minute presentation on what the plan is, what the goals are, what the threats are, and then just kind of have a conversation with them on what they see happening in the future. And they were great. They gave us a lot of relevancy and perspective, especially in the context of ever-changing conservation in Belize. The standards are always changing. The plans are always changing. Especially Protected Areas Conservation Trust and NPAS, the Protected Areas Secretariat, were really able to give us an idea of what the standards might become in the near future and how we can keep our plan flexible to meet those standards. And then finally, we hosted a community forum with the village of Trio. They have the agricultural concession in a different protected area that Yakshay manages. And so there's already a relationship there. They're also the closest community to the entrance of Bladen Nature Reserve, and so we thought it was really important to get their perspective. We were hoping to host it as a World Cafe style. Some issues of time and limited translation ability kind of forced us to alter that. But we still got lots of great feedback on protected area management. We gave a short presentation. Saeed, the science director, gave a short presentation on biodiversity. Lots of great pictures, got the crowd going. And then we asked 4 different teams to answer a question related to protected area management in general, with the thought that we could ask them it generally and then pull what we needed more specific to Bladen. And one really key piece of feedback came from this, and that is every single person in the room was most concerned, first and foremost, with what are the rules, what are the regulations, and what are the penalties. And so that really, we had to bring that out more in our plan after we talked to this community and make that more clear. In general, though, this consultation process, both with Yakshay and talking to the external stakeholders in this community, as I said, it gave us great perspective and great relevancy to our plan. We think that a full stakeholder analysis, where they talk to everyone, they have like 45 people on their stakeholder list for this reserve, should be done in the near future, probably for the next plan. And so that's also one of our recommendations for Yakshay. And with that, we'll talk a little bit about each of our side projects and then go through some general reflections and conclusion. So, Erica.
Thanks. So as Dylan mentioned, we had quite a bit of time in July while we were waiting for feedback on the management plan to do a couple of side projects. Myself, I worked with our science director, Saeed, to develop a bat monitoring program or protocol. And what this involved was another lit review. I created a couple of graphics you can see up here on the screen detailing mist net and harp trap setup. And then I worked with the college intern at Yakshay to determine a good location for their new acoustic trap, which monitors bat populations by sound. It's really cool. I'd never heard of this technology, so that was fun to learn about. And I created a final document divided into 4 sections going over why bat monitoring in Belize, some capacity building that will need to take place at Yache in order to develop a bat monitoring protocol, whether that's technical or physical assistance with creating these monitoring protocols, methods, different ways to trap and monitor bats, which, as I mentioned, is mist netting and harp traps for physically capturing the bats. You can take measurements and species, wingspan, or the acoustic trap, which just gets the species from the noises they're making. And finally, a data management section that detailed what should be collected when you use these different methods, where data should be stored, and how it should be analyzed.
Thank you. So I got to work with Yache on their human-jaguar interaction or their conflict. So Belize actually has the highest amount of jaguars in Central America. And even though they have a low population, they still have issues with jaguars and humans. So this comprised of me going to the Belize Jaguar Working Group meeting. It was held in Belmopan, which is actually the capital of Belize, at the Forest Department headquarters. And it was really cool. I just got to sit there and watch the collaborative conservation in action and just to see what different groups are doing to mitigate this issue. I also got to go to a farm visit, 2 of them actually. Dylan will talk more about like what that comprised of. Again, I was just kind of there and watching and soaking it in what they were doing. And then I did some literature review as well. This allowed me to create activities, games, and a pre and post survey for one of the days for their summer camp. So there's a result from one of the pre-survey questions that I asked the kids. So it was 30 children, ages 9 to 12. They were from surrounding villages, and then they got to attend the whole entire week. So there's some pictures of us doing the games and stuff. And the survey was for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services. They provided a grant to Yache to work on the human-jaguar issues. So with that, I'll hand it over to Dylan, who also worked on this.
So I also worked with this human-jaguar project team at Yache, and my main focus was creating baseline maps for some of their demonstration farms. Before we arrived, they had identified 8 different farmers through a farm profile survey who would be interested in having some sort of mitigation techniques implemented on their land. Some of the different techniques include solar lights, solar-powered sound alarms, even something simple as having a donkey. It's supposed to make noise when a jaguar is near and scare it away. And what they needed was a baseline map of what the farm looked like. And so Courtney joined along on a couple of the farm visits, and we walked around the perimeter of the farms with a GPS unit, walked around any sort of corral or fencing area that they might put their cattle in the evenings, and then also noted the location of wildlife cameras that we installed to monitor for the presence of jaguars. And it resulted in some very simple maps, but they're available for Yache to add on to as they implement these different mitigation techniques. And they're also available for Yache to be able to go to the farmer and show them the map and say, we want to put a light here, we want to put a sound alarm over here, etc. And this provided lots of great experience with GIS mapping, something I hadn't done very much before. So that was a really wonderful experience. And then the final side project we took on as a group, it was a sustainable land use handbook for the community outreach and livelihoods team at Yache. We worked primarily with the protected areas management team with the Bladen Reserve plan, as might make sense. So this was a great opportunity to see the other side of Yache's work. They do a lot of work with communities promoting sustainable agricultural practices and fire awareness. Fire is a really big problem there, largely created by slash and burn agriculture, and so they try to promote slash and mulch instead. Additionally, Yache is the first responders to any wildfire in southern Belize, them and another NGO. There's no big fire department going out to fight the fire. And so this handbook really puts their agricultural work, their slash and burn work, and their wildfire work all in the same place with protocols and policies for them to safely handle fire, whether they're trying to do a controlled burn on somebody's fields or whether there's a wildfire out in the bush. And so a lot of it was kind of compiled in different places. People had started to create phone trees, etc., and we really worked to just compile everything into one location. And that was a great experience. With some conclusions.
So if you're at all familiar with this program, CLTL, we're big on reflection. So I'm going to briefly go through some of our takeaways with regard to conservation in Belize. Start with some pros. They have a really good baseline, as Courtney mentioned. There's a lot of areas still left to conserve and protect. And going along with that, there's a lot of really dedicated people and organizations working towards this goal of conservation in Belize. We had the good fortune to work with some of those people at Yakshay and get to know others at Tide and organizations around Punta Gorda. And finally, they're open to change. So if someone comes along with an idea that they think will work in the context of what they're doing in conservation, they're open to trying it out. So it was a really great learning experience for all of us. The cons are pretty similar to cons you find in conservation work, no matter where you are in the world. Funding's always an issue. Funding in Belize mostly comes from foreign grants, and it's a small grant pool that a lot of people are competing over. There's a good deal of turnover as volunteers come and go. And this can lead occasionally to inconsistent reporting where the new volunteer has to figure out what their predecessor was doing, the system they were using, and then make it their own and continue the same work but with a different person, a different name. And then short-staffed. The people at Yakshay were amazing. One of my first weekends there, I went and helped out on the farm of one of the rangers because he had been spending all of his time helping out with the slash and mulch techniques that Dylan was mentioning earlier. So he hadn't had time to do trimming for his own farm. So me and another former CLTL student who's working at Yakshay, along with some other volunteers from in town, went to help out on his farm and trim some cacao trees. And finally to Courtney.
So to some more informal takeaways. We have be flexible, so the time moves differently in Belize, and we had to learn real fast that our timeline was just rough. It had to change. Be present. We were only for a limited amount of time, so just make sure that we were soaking in all of our experiences in the culture. Develop a community, so we wanted to create relationships with not only our coworkers at Yakshay, but I had lost awesome landlords, Erica had a bunch of roommates, Dylan had great neighbors, and just creating a community within Punta Gorda. And then Belize is amazing. It is an incredibly beautiful country, and the people there are some of the best people I've ever met in my life. They're so friendly and gracious, hospitable. It was great. And then finally, remember to have fun and explore. We were lucky enough to take an awesome field trip. It was 4 days, 3 nights. We got to go with Daniela, sitting right there. She was up in Sarchaniha. And we got to go visit a couple other protected areas, the zoo and the baboon sanctuary. And then we also did some exploring on our own with some friends and family that came and visited us. And then with that, I'll hand things over to Dylan who close things out.
With that, we want to say thank you to everybody who supported us, specifically our leadership team at Yakshay. Christina, Carla, and Saeed were incredibly helpful, welcoming everything you could ask for. Our committee, being flexible with us, giving us great feedback, showing up on a snowy morning. Everybody else at Yakshay, really the whole organization, could not have been more welcoming to us. And then everybody who assisted us otherwise with these external consultations or feedback remotely. Really, it was a team effort, and we couldn't have done it without everybody and our friends and family. They supported us and Skyped us when we were lonely. With that, thank you.